Hey, what's up guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm coming at you with yet another video, and today I'm going to be talking about a pre-Countdown Cup tier list for the Overwatch League teams. So firstly, a few quick disclaimers that are necessary to get out of the way. First of all, this is all my opinion. You don't have to agree with it. If you disagree with it, comment down below what you disagree with and why, and we can have a bit of a discussion in the comment section about it. Then I have to say this tier list about the Countdown Cup will not include strength of schedule, so it's just going to be where teams stack up against each other, disregarding who they're actually playing. And finally, when I talk about some tiers, some of them will all just be grouped together and I'll talk about the tier as a whole, whereas others, for more specific cases, I'll have to go in depth on certain teams rather than grouping them up with the rest of their tier as a whole. Alright, so let's get into this. Starting with the first tier. This is the meh tier. So the teams I have here, quite expected, are the Vancouver Titans, the LA Valiant, and the London Spitfire. Now, all of these teams still don't have a single win. So I'll start by going over the Vancouver Titans. Now, the Vancouver Titans have gifted us, put that in quotation marks, because I'm not a huge fan of it, but it's interesting nevertheless. They've gifted us with this storyline of breadsticks. Week by week, the Vancouver Titans have some tasks and some challenges in-game they have to complete, and then by the end, if they complete them all, they'll be rewarded with breadsticks. That's right, they're not aiming for a win. They're aiming to win some breadsticks. To be honest, I think that alone tells you all you need to know about the standings of this team, but I'll be a bit realistic for a second. The Vancouver Titans have looked competitive in a limited number of series, but that does kind of give you hope that when they face another horrific team, they might have an opportunity to win. While they're still definitely not predicted to win a game, just like the LA Valiant are, we can expect to see them go close with a couple of teams, which, if you see Vancouver go to a few map 5s and make it look competitive, I think will be a success for this team going into the Countdown Cup. The next team up I won't talk too much about because they're in a similar boat to the Vancouver Titans, and this is the Los Angeles Valiant. Now, both these teams are most definitely the worst teams in their region. I'd say the LA Valiant are going to have a tougher time finding a win though. While we'd say that North America has more better teams in the region, it also definitely has more poor teams that you can hope a bad team could be. The LA Valiant, a step up from them is probably the Guangzhou Charge, and that looks so out of sight for the LA Valiant, whereas if we saw Valiant in a region with the Vancouver Titans, it would definitely be a winnable series for them, I'd say. So now let's talk about the final member of this meh tier, and I'd say this is the most interesting one because they actually have an opportunity to push up higher in the table, I'd say, and that is the London Spitfire. Now, Spitfire are expected to win one game throughout the rest of the season, which is a good opportunity for them to get out of this horrific pack of teams and maybe become mildly decent, even though that would be at a stretch. The London Spitfire, out of these bottom 3 teams, is without a doubt the best one. When London and Vancouver play, London should be able to take that one away easily. But let's talk about them in comparison to every other team in the league. Well, we saw them go up against Paris, which we thought would be a winnable series, but Paris have gone above and beyond all of our expectations, so they lost that. However, London Spitfire have made it very close against some very good teams, which inspires hope into fans of this team, and also just supporters of the league that don't want to see so many teams on 0 wins. Don't get me wrong, London Spitfire is definitely a poor performing team this season, and going into the Countdown Cup this is expected to continue. But if there's hope for any of these teams, there's hope for the London Spitfire. That wraps up the meh tier for us, so now let's talk about the next tier up, the better than trash tier. If you see your favourite team here, they're better than trash. They're not one of these horrific teams, but you don't expect them to go too much higher up the table in this Countdown Cup tournament. Expect them to lose against middle of the pack teams, but beat the absolutely terrible ones. Now, 2 of the teams here you might be shocked by, but I don't think you should be, and the first one is the New York Excelsior. The New York Excelsior have made Hawaii once, and have made the knockouts once as well. And on paper, this looks like this team must be middle of the pack at worst. But no, when you watch these guys play, and you watch how they've got to these points, to me it still all just seems like a fluke. Nothing in the New York Excelsior gives me confidence that they'll be able to consistently rival top tier teams, but not even top tier teams, middle of the pack teams. New York somehow loses to the worst teams in this region, and then somehow manages to get to an international top 4. When they were there, they did lose every single game, which was quite expected, and I think that teaches us that New York really isn't a very good team. You could make the argument that New York should be higher up than this point, but this is where I feel like putting them, because nothing in their play has made me think that they'll be able to consistently be, and consistently just be better than the other APAC teams I have ahead of them. I will say, New York might have a bit more potential than I've been giving them credit for so far. Since the addition of Kalios, they haven't looked all that terrible. He's really brought out Yakpung's play, which I think was a weakness in this team. So if you want to be hopeful as a New York fan, look out for that tank line. They could be making strides for this team, but then again, they haven't done anything to prove to me that that will actually occur. I do have another APAC team in this tier, but I'll talk about the other shocking team that I have here as well first, and that is the Florida Mayhem. Now, throughout this season, they have looked like a middle of the pack team. They had very high highs in the first tournament we saw where they made top 4 and didn't even come last in that as NYXL did, but since then they've been on a steady, rapid decline. OG had poor performances consistently, which led this team to have to sub in Checkmate at the main tank position, and since that's happened, nothing has looked good. I think Florida Mayhem are really just trying to get through this season so they can make big changes in the off-season, which as a fan of the Florida Mayhem you should not feel confident in. In a season where we've seen versatility pay off so much, having a poor main tank that can't flex onto anything other than the Orisa is a very bad condition for your team to be in. This leads me to my ranking of the Florida Mayhem at this better than trash tier, because nothing fills me with faith that they'll go higher, but I do think the sheer talent of some other players on their team will prevent them from getting down to that horrific spot below them. Alright, finally for this position, it could be the only expected one. The Guangzhou Charge. Now the Guangzhou Charge have been looking like a poor team in the APAC region. Could that come as a result of there not being many bad teams for them to beat up on? Possibly, but could it come from them just being a poor team overall? I think that's more likely. The Guangzhou Chargers roster doesn't look all that horrific, but since the start of the season we have seen them perform poorly consistently. Nothing has changed to make me think that will improve going into the Countdown Cup, which leads me to this ranking, as this is pretty much where I've seen them throughout the whole season. Not horrific, not good, not mediocre. Just better than trash. Guangzhou Charge doesn't strike me as the team that will be volatile enough to hit really high highs. I think they're just consistently at this level, which is quite disappointing. You'll see a team above them, Guangzhou Spark, I think have the opportunity to really go very high up at given occasions, which going into the Countdown Cup and then playoffs will be really useful for low tier teams. I don't think Guangzhou Charge quite possesses that ability to suddenly rapidly increase their performance. Okay, so that's it for the better than trash tier. Let's move up to the high potential teams. These teams will either currently be at their peak that we've seen throughout their whole season, they're on the rise and have the ability to go higher, or they might be coming out of a slump, but are expected to rapidly increase their performances for whatever given reason. The team I'm going to be talking about first is a perfect example of that second reason why they're in the high potential category. The Philadelphia Fusion. Now, Fusion have sort of disappointed us for a while now. They've not hit a top 4, which has kind of been expected of them, but going into the Countdown Cup, I think this is their best opportunity to do so. Throughout the whole of the Summer Showdown, they'd been integrating players back into the roster, which kind of gives them a pass as to why they were performing so poorly. But now they've got their roster at almost full strength, and this team looks like a force to be reckoned with. I think Philadelphia Fusion stonks are going to be on a high, and you want to buy them right now while they're cheap. Fusion is the one team that I think will have the biggest shift from their previous stage to this stage. The integration phase is over, and they should stop messing about with shuffling players in and out. Now it's time for Fusion to really prove to us what we wanted to see from them in the pre-season. Not only that, but I'd argue that the Fusion have a better roster than they had going into the pre-season. I mean, you got Toby now, who you can use for Brig, and Rascal, I think, is a great improvement for this team over EQO, which some might disagree with. But that's it for the Philadelphia Fusion. Let's move on. Next I'll talk about 3 teams who I think are all quite in a similar boat. These are the the Paris Eternal, the Toronto Defiant, and the Boston Uprising. Between all these teams, I see great strides from what people were predicting of them in the preseason, other than the Toronto Defiant in my case. The Paris Eternal and Boston Uprising have found great recent success in the Summer Showdown, both making knockouts, whereas Toronto Defiant's success has come from a more long-term improvement from what people were thinking of them originally. The reason I put these guys in high potential for the Paris Eternal and Boston Uprising is because they're currently at that peak that they've reached. They both made knockouts, and now it's time to see if they're going to be able to improve further and become top-tier teams in their respective regions. Toronto Defiant, on the other hand, I think have looked great with Aspire in. And I think more time with Aspire is going to really push these guys to fight for a top spot in North America. Whereas now they're currently middle of the pack to high middle of the pack in that region. So that's it for those three teams. Next we'll talk about the Hangzhou Spark, a team that I shouted out in the better than trash tier, comparing them to a better Guangzhou Charge. Hangzhou Spark, I feel, has shown us extremely high potential throughout the whole season. Some games they are able to absolutely dominate even the highest tier teams, whereas other times they're just middle of the pack and mediocre. If Hangzhou Spark is able to harness that great play and pump out those performances consistently, there's no doubt in my mind that they're going to be able to be a top tier APAC team. When we see Hangzhou at their peak, they rival that of the Shanghai Dragons in their region, whereas at their worst times, they're only a bit better than the Guangzhou Charge. So the reason I put them in high potential is because when they're good, they're extremely good, and if they're able to get those kinds of performances regularly, they're going to be phenomenal. But that's it with the high potential teams. Now let's talk about those teams that are pushing for the top. So the teams I've got at the top are the Summer Showdown top 4 teams, the Shanghai Dragons, the Dallas Fuel, the Chengdu Hunters, and the Atlanta Reign. So the teams in this pushing for top category are the ones that are going to try and dethrone those 4 teams and try and take a top 4 spot for themselves in the Countdown Cup. I'll kick things off with 2 teams that I think are very similar, the Los Angeles Gladiators and the Washington Justice. Both these teams, we saw quite a good performance in the Summer Showdown come out from them. They both made knockouts and did reasonably well when they were there. I feel both these teams are finally reaching the levels of play that we had expected of them in the pre-season. And with that information in mind, I think there's a strong possibility that they'll be able to dethrone one of these North America teams and go to Hawaii. From the Washington Justice, I want to highlight MAG. MAG, I think, is a perfect indication of this team's season as a whole. They started off very good, but they hadn't quite proven to us that they were really up there because they hadn't played very impressive teams. Then, when they were given more challenging competition, cracks started to show in the play of the Washington Justice and in MAG himself. However, since then, they've bounced back and they've been able to absolutely dominate some of the best teams in the league. Washington Justice and MAG are on the up and up and up, and they really have a good opportunity to take down one of these top 2 North American teams. Out of all the North American teams that I can see taking down one of the top teams, in my opinion, is the Washington Justice. I see them going to Hawaii in the Countdown Cup, but they'll have to do a lot of work to get there. Next, I want to highlight maybe a bit of a controversial pick, the Seoul Dynasty from the APAC region. Now, the reason I've got these guys here is because they've looked surprisingly consistent all season. Seoul Dynasty have been performing at a very high level in the APAC region since the start of this season, and it's been very impressive for me. Seoul Dynasty had an extremely close series with the Chengdu Hunters, which, if they were able to take it away, they would have gone to Hawaii in the Summer Showdown. Now I think, though, coming back for round 2, Seoul Dynasty has a real opportunity to win a series like that one and take it to Hawaii. Recently, the Seoul Dynasty has been firing on all cylinders, and it's been great to watch. Therefore, I think out of all the APAC teams, if I can see either the Shanghai Dragons or Chengdu Hunters being dethroned, I think Seoul Dynasty will be the ones to do it. Unless NYXL does NYXL things, then that's going to put a bit of a spanner in the works. Also, quick side note, Prophet is putting in a word for most flexible player in the league. I mean, he's not done any cross-role stuff like many other players have, which would probably make him the definite candidate for most flexible player in the league, but he's been playing hit scan regularly for this team. We see him on McCree, and he looks goddamn good on it. You're not meant to be playing hit scan, Prophet. Please, stop being so good at the game. Give someone else a chance. So the final 2 teams for this pushing for top tier are the Houston Outlaws and the San Francisco Shock. Both these teams seem to be, in the regular season, juggernauts of this region. Against the teams that aren't considered the tippity top of North America, they absolutely dominate. So the question is, why can't they translate this into wins when it comes to the knockouts to get them to Hawaii? Well, for the San Francisco Shock, I feel like their downfall is having to swap players in and out for specific compositions. Sure, on paper it seems great having a specialist for some role. I mean, if that becomes meta, or if it's always meta on a certain map, you're going to dominate every single time they're in. The problem with this is you don't have quite the same in-game versatility as you would if you just had a solid 6-man roster that started every time and could play a range of different compositions, albeit to a slightly lower level. This, I think, is actually the Shanghai Dragons' biggest strength. They're able to stick with a 6-man starting lineup and have them in for every single map. But that doesn't weaken them one bit. In fact, it improves their play, because within these maps they can make the switches that they need to see come through to win the game. Currently, the Overwatch League is at a point where there's pretty much no meta. I mean, the meta may be map dependent, but within those maps you can pick counters, and this is what Overwatch is meant to be. You're meant to make the switches to win the game, and we're finally actually seeing that in the Overwatch League, which I see Shanghai Dragon dominating on. And I think that is, quite surprisingly, a weakness of the San Francisco Shock, a historically very flexible team. While we look at their roster and they have the players to fill the holes of any given meta, we don't quite see that within players themselves. Sure, you're able to have your specialists, you know, supers on the bench if you ever want to play Reinhardt, but that's not what we want to see at this current point in the game. We want to see players that can play everything to a suitable degree, not players that can play certain things to an extremely high degree. And then we've got the Houston Outlaws, and Houston could have suffered from some early stages hype. What I mean by this is Houston Outlaws popped off in the first 2 stages of the Overwatch League regular season, that is. And to be honest, I don't want to bring up strength of schedule because I'm not talking about that for the Countdown Cup. But there may be a reason that whenever we see Houston Outlaws go to knockouts and play the truly great teams, there's a reason that's the point at which they fail. So I just think the weakness is Houston Outlaws is applying their dominance from playing poor teams to playing against the great teams. So I've spoken about why Houston Outlaws possibly won't make the top 4 teams. But why are they pushing for that point anyway? What makes them so good? Well, I think when we look at this team playing Reinhardt composition specifically, they've got it down to a T. I mean, they are phenomenal whenever Django's in on the Rhine. But when it comes to anything else, that's where it gets a bit shaky. And I think this is actually similar to the San Francisco Shock. We see at the main tank role, you've got Django for the Reinhardt, sometimes the Winston, sometimes the Orisa. But then you've got Dreamer on the bench to play those things as well, and when you're in a meta where you need to switch compositions quickly, you don't have the time to sub players in and out always when you need the switches to be made. So they fall short at a similar point as the San Francisco Shock, in my opinion at least. What could make both these teams, the Houston Outlaws and San Francisco Shock, do good is if we did just see a solid meta rise. These teams, I feel, would be great when it comes to a micro level of play. If they're able to master a composition that suddenly comes out to be meta, I think they'll be pretty much unstoppable. Whereas I think a team like the Atlanta Reign benefits from a diverse meta where they're able to make switches to counter the opponent and win that way, rather than learning micro levels of a certain composition. And that takes us on to our top 4 teams: the Shanghai Dragons, Dallas Fuel, Chengdu Hunters, and Atlanta Reign. And I'm not going to cover these guys in this video because I have a separate video coming out where I discuss the 4 top teams from the Summer Showdown and where I think they'll stand in the Countdown Cup, so stay tuned for that one. If you enjoyed the video, please do like, comment, subscribe, and share it to all your friends or family or other, and I'll catch you in the next one. Goodbye.